a very hard job, no.
You are very good at public relations with senators, that we recognize the challenges you face. So do either one of you belong to this working group? Does the Army or the FAA participate? And can you answer that so the NTSB can pursue the information?
I mean, the FAA, it's the FAA's working group.
It's the FAA's working group. All right. Mr. Rushlow, what's the problem?
I'm happy to work with the chair. We've been working extremely closely together on this investigation, and I'm happy to work with the chair and understand why she hasn't received that information and make sure we follow up on that.
Can you think of any reason that NTSB shouldn't be a part of that information?
Off the top of my head, I can't. I don't know why they would be restricted in that, and I certainly will talk to my folks when we get back.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Chairman, should we ask is the Army part of this working group as well?
The Army is part of the working group. Yes, Senator.
There are apparently 17 entities that are part of the working group. We just haven't been able to verify who all the entities are.
Surely the FAA is in charge, and they can help you.
Surely I would have been happy to understand that before today and work
General,
with
you
the
know any
chair.
reasons that the working group's efforts can't be known by NTSB?
Absolutely not.
Thank you. Let me follow up. Mr. Rochelow indicated that the FAA does have the authority to require ATSB out. Do you agree with that assessment that the FAA can make this decision, and if you don't follow the FAA policies, then you're precluded from the airspace?
Chairman, the Army operates 100% under FAA authority.
Very good. And let me turn to the perhaps the next steps or new information, and to this I'll go to Chair Hamady. Since the report that we're discussing here today is 2 weeks old, what has transpired, if anything, in those 2 weeks? Have you discovered any new and relevant information that you can share with us?
Where would you like me to begin? One thing I can say on ADSB out, off, that's policy of the Army, but we are also still looking at installation programming and potential for equipment malfunction. And the reason I mention this is because the accident helicopter, for this accident helicopter, no ADSB data had been received from an FAA ground station for 730 days prior to the accident, and that was abnormal. So we began looking at the fleet for the battalion. The battalion had 25 helicopters. That includes this particular helicopter. 9 of them were Mike models, and all were transmitting ADSB out when they were turned on, because we have to verify that it's working. There were 16 Limas, including the accident helicopter, which we're still looking at, but 7 were transmitting when ADSB out was turned on. 8 were not, and stopped doing so sometime between May and November 2023. We don't know why. 5 of those started transmitting since the NTSB identified the issue and began working with the Army to try to isolate the reason. So I just want to let you know that you can have ADSB out on, but you also have to make sure that it's working.
You indicated working with the Army, but there's other participants in this arena.
Absolutely.
And then were you narrowing it to the Army as if something is necessarily wrong there? Or more broadly, there's a problem in receiving the information?
For the ADSB out on, we wanted to look at the helicopter fleet for the battalion to see if whether ADSB out on, when turned on, was actually transmitting data, because we did think it was abnormal that for the helicopter involved in the accident wasn't transmitting data for so long.
Any explanation, General?
Chairman, this exactly is what the value of the investigation is. There are things that you would not normally look at that are being determined here, and that's certainly going to help us drive policy and any changes that we need to do as a result of the investigation. And certainly the NTSB has the expertise to do that.
So what we're hearing from Chair Hamady is that there may be, it may be transmitting, it may be on, but there's there's no receipt. There's, I don't know, technical problems in the process by which it's not providing the information it's supposed to provide, right?
Chairman, obviously, the functionality of any Army equipment, it's certainly Army aviation equipment, is important to me. So if we're discovering that there's a challenge there, we will take direct action, absolutely.
This is not an inconsequential thing, right?
It's not. And I think for the public watching, because I think there are a lot of people watching, is ADSB out broadcasts latitude, longitude, and altitude and velocity once per second. It updates once per second versus 4 to 6 seconds for radar, which is significant when you have converging aircraft.
Mr. Rocheleau, you indicated as of today there's a change in policy at FAA. I would be interested in knowing if that change in policy is only related to DCA airspace, or you are making those requirements, putting those requirements in place for other airports.
Thank you, Senator. So the requirements that I announced today are effective for the DC Class B airspace immediately. That part of our ongoing work, as I related earlier with respect to hotspots and the mixed traffic that we've seen that could be problematic, are areas where we're looking at kind of adding that requirement in. It seems premature simply along the lines of the way airspace is structured in different locations that we need to focus before acting too quickly. So we want to make sure that as we're looking at the different airspaces and how they're constructed, that we're taking kind of intentional, careful action.
And that intentional action is underway. You're doing
Yes,
that
sir.
at other airports
Absolutely.
today.
And wherever we find a risk, we will mitigate that risk immediately.
Chairman Hamady, I asked you a question, then I interrupted you, and you sound like your answer would be lengthy of the things that you've learned in the last 2 weeks. I'll come back to you after recognizing the two senators to my left.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on what Chairwoman Hamady is talking about, testing the ADSB out, whether it's actually transmitting data, because the data was not received. Will we be able to check that with all of the other rotary wing operators that are in this region as well? Is that something the FAA should be mandating? Is that they could do that? I mean, you're not looking at the other operators because they're not part of this accident, correct? So then my question for Mr. Rocheleau is, will you be directing will the FAA be directing all of the other helicopter operators, whether it's Homeland Security, local law enforcement, who have this exemption to ADSB out, will you be directing that they actually test their equipment to make sure that it is actually transmitting the data that can be received?
Yes, Senator. I think that's part of our ongoing work in the collaboration between those operators and how we make sure they, first and foremost, understand the requirement, and second, that their equipment is functional.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to also follow up on my earlier questioning about the FAA's air traffic controller workforce. I had mentioned you had committed to looking at the list of names I gave you that I will be giving you for the air traffic controllers who are waiting for medical review. I would like for you to commit to reporting back to me in writing about how many controllers around the country are waiting for medical clearances so that they can return to work, and what the FAA is doing to make sure these medical reviews are happening in a timely manner.
I will commit to that.
Thank you. In the race to hire more air traffic controllers, and then the staffing was adequate on that evening, but we could have used more air traffic controllers, obviously. And in the race to hire more air traffic controllers, I want to make sure the FAA does not lower your long-standing high standards for air traffic controllers. There could be a temptation to sacrifice effectiveness for efficiency, but the FAA must stick to its stringent standards to protect safety. Can you assure this committee that as the administration works to hire more air traffic controllers, you will not in any way lower the high standards that is currently required for individuals to become certified air traffic controllers? And there's plenty of places, a lot of them are in actually Kansas, that have the expertise to help us train air traffic controllers, as long as we keep those high standards.
100%. Part of our ongoing activity to surge in air traffic controller hiring is to look for the best and the brightest, and that's exactly what we're going to continue to do.
Thank you. You're back, Mr. Chair.
To follow up on Senator Duckworth, you should look to Kansas, and we'd welcome you. I'm going to turn to Senator Schmidt, in just 1 second. General, the senator from Illinois was asking about routine maintenance and determining whether equipment is working. You have a standard in place that what Chairwoman Amity said, it doesn't make sense to me that you wouldn't know there were problems with the transmission or the equipment. Do you have a protocol in place and is that equipment inspected on a continuing basis?
Certainly, Chairman, with general aviation operations, we have protocols for the status of aircraft. I will have to get back to you and take it for the record on what the protocol is to ensure that ADSB out transmissions outside of the aircraft are being received. That's something I'll have to look on. How do we do that?
And whether protocol is being followed.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Senator Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my friend from Illinois would agree. I certainly don't want to. I don't want to see us reduce standards. I guess, and following in that same spirit, with Mr. Rochlow, can you commit that no hiring decisions will be made based on race?
Yes, sir. Again, we're looking for the best and the brightest, and we're prioritizing those who are best qualified.
Because, as you know, there's a lawsuit by about 1,000 folks who are claiming that they didn't get a job because of their race, the FAA.
We're all about making sure the best and the brightest are there, and we do that through a testing mechanism.
That's great to hear. I did want to ask, General, and again, I apologize if this has been asked before. They're running us in and out of here, different committee hearings, armed services. I did want to ask, this was a very strong crew in the Black Hawk. Is it typical, or I guess, is it a problem? Is it typical and is it a problem to have someone who is a lower rank as this is my understanding, that the evaluator was a lower rank than the pilot? Is that a typical situation? Is that problematic? Is that not a problem? Do you think it contributed in any way? I just wanted to get your assessment.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. It is extremely typical in Army aviation because the preponderance of our force are our warrant officers, and they are professional aviators. That's what they do for their entire career. And so they are our instructor pilots, our maintenance test pilots, our safety officers, and our commissioned officers fill roles of leadership within the organization. So it's a very routine to have a senior member being evaluated by a junior member.
Okay, so I'm sure you've gone through this analysis, and I just feel like in the spirit of making sure we're getting this right moving forward, that you don't think there's a systemic problem associated with maybe somebody with a lower rank saying something to somebody of a higher rank in those kind of situations. You've went through that analysis, I'm assuming.
Absolutely, and that is certainly the personalities of crew members and capabilities is something that is considered in that risk brief process for every single flight. Is it the right crew? Is the crew mixed properly? Commanders would know if there's issues with simple as they don't get along. And commanders would take that into account before approving any flight.
And I guess for the FAA, and again, maybe you've been asked this before, but clearly in the chairman's opening statement and a number of the committee members, just the report, the statistics of the number of near misses between helicopters and aircraft landing at DCA, that, you know, those operations now have been halted. Can you just explain to the American people why that didn't happen before?
So, again, I'll say that the reports that were come in previously were certainly analyzed, but something was missed, and since that time, we've been using new tools available to us, artificial intelligence, machine learning, to be able to scan the tens of millions of data points, to be able to do that analysis in a more proactive and ideally at some point here predictive way to identify risk earlier and to mitigate that risk.
But this wasn't a new issue at DCA, right? This is an issue that had been a longstanding concern. Is that accurate?
It's accurate. There were a number of reports that came in, and I would say that we've, as I mentioned earlier, we investigate every single near mid-air collision, and even as we talk about spectrum issues, Chairman Cruz mentioned, we have teams that go out and assess the airspace itself, making sure that we're working with partners, whether it's on counter-UAS technology, to make sure that airspace is as clean as possible from interference.
And so moving forward, obviously, as a response to the tragedy that happened, and I would be remiss not to express my condolences to the families who are here. I know everyone has, and it's devastating for each and every one of you, including some folks from back home. And so your advocacy does matter, and it will carry beyond today, right? This is important. So I ask, in the spirit of that, moving forward then, is that how you see things, that the state of play as it currently is now will continue?
Yes, sir. We'll continue to use the latest tools we have to be able to assess that data and work with the industry, with the aviation ecosystem, if you will, to identify that risk early and to mitigate that risk immediately.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Schmidt. Mr. Rocheleau, at the moment, whether it's on or off is irrelevant because there's no flights. You're announcing something that doesn't, at the moment, matter because you have not lifted the ban on the flights. Is that true?
So it's helpful to, if I can just point to the graphic. In the graphic, I can explain that in the yellow sectioned area, the graphic there, that is where there is no mixed traffic. No helicopters, no fixed wing, except for those very few circumstances where we have emergency national security type of traffic. In the red section, in that red airspace, is where ADSB out, so DCA Class B airspace, is now required. You'll also notice where, based on the NTSB recommendations, where we've eliminated Route 4 down going north to south on the Potomac, as well as Route 6 that formerly, you can see on the left side of the graphic, was in effect between from the west to the east, where Bowling Air Force Base is.
I'll have to think about that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, just for the record, because I see we have several
Senator Campbell,
colleagues.
you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify on your point, Acting Administrator, we still have a rule that says they have an exemption, all sensitive. So I know you're making a declaration today, but I don't think that supersedes the rule. Now, maybe President Trump's going to call all these agencies and tell them to stand down, but legally, whatever the FAA is doing today doesn't take precedent over that rule. So when I come back for a second round.
I believe the FAA has control over that airspace, and they can say.
They can definitely shut it down, but as it relates to the rule, his decision just to say that you now have this requirement that a rule gave them an exemption to.
I think he can issue an emergency directive. Is that correct?
So it's the agreement we have in place with the helicopter operations that fly without ADSB out is an actual memorandum of agreement. It is not a formal rule. So it's an agreement we have with the Department of Defense and the other helicopter operators in the DC area.
And we can get a copy of that, the
Yes,
MOU? Thank you.
Senator Hickenlooper. Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Rocheleau, you earlier testified that you've looked at the airports with higher volumes of mixed traffic. I think you mentioned Boston, Dallas, Anchorage. Is that assessment, have you gone through all the airports? I mean, does that mean that other airports in other large cities or where we have a fair amount of mixed traffic are okay?
Good job, thank you.
So we have 10 locations, a total of 21 airports. So we are doing this hotspot review, this mixed traffic review across the nation, including in the Anchorage area. So we're reviewing all the airspace designs to see where we may have this indicator of risk with mixed traffic, so helicopter operations as well as fixed wing.
And so you mentioned Boston, Dallas, and Anchorage. That's not the full list, I assume.
That's correct, sir.
And so when will this be done?
So obviously, 21 locations, I'm receiving regular updates. I anticipate that being, I anticipate that activity being concluded in the next couple weeks. I will tell you that our teams they're being very intentional about how they go through that airspace because it's been built over time as it relates to helicopter routes and other approaches and departure routes. So we're being very intentional, very careful. We don't want to move quickly with inducing additional risk.
Right, I understand that, but obviously time is of the essence.
Yes, sir.
When you're in a situation like this, making sure that even a preliminary warning as part of that assessment would be pretty valuable.
And any indicator that there's an emerging risk, we would take immediate action.
Ms. Hamady, you have in the past talked about workforce and making sure that you are fully staffed. And I think this is a direct follow-up on that. Are we fully staffed? I mean, you're going to look at this entire incident, and it's going to take the typical year and a half or 2 years, which, again, drives a lot of my constituents crazy. Do you have a timeline for when you will finish the full incident report or whatever the legal description is, when that will happen?
We've committed to 1 year, barring any unforeseen circumstances, but 1 year.
And so you have enough staffing on that?
We have 40 experts at the NTSB that are currently leading this investigation. It is a high workload because it's not their only investigation that they're focused on, but they're very committed to this one. And then we have an entire agency that supports them.
Right. We saw we have a array of past reports, and it varies dramatically, but I appreciate the fact that you're trying to accelerate this. I think it frustrates a lot of people that it takes so long. I mean, how long does it take to gather the facts?
So, I mean, it is a complex investigations, and our investigations are very broad. And there's a lot of information that can change over time, and we are very fact-based, following the evidence. So we do, that's our credibility, so we want to be exact when we issue something. I will say, I do have to congratulate our workforce, because when I came on as chair, we had well over 400, close to 500 reports that were 2, 3, 4 years old, and they're now below 2. Right. So that is significant, but the complexity of investigations, and then the fact that some things we don't have control over, like if we can't get access to evidence because a district attorney or law enforcement is prohibiting us in a certain situation with a highway crash, that can extend the timeline.
Sure. No, I've seen that. But I think in something like this, where time is of the essence, I appreciate you guys making the effort, and glad to hear that you have the workforce. Mr. Rushlow, in your testimony, you highlighted some of the recent changes in hiring, and also especially in the training processes to make sure we have more qualified air traffic controllers, but full workforce. I know you're working with local colleges all over the country on that. Is that is that working? I mean, I think if we can accelerate that, we have Metro State in Denver is a place where we're turning out some of these members. Is that something you can ramp up?
I'm very interested, and the Secretary has been very clear with the public as well as with me that we need to surge this hiring and do it well. Again, back to the testing, the surge, bringing people in. As it relates to additional college initiatives, we have an enhanced college training initiative, ECTIs, that we're using in, I believe, 4 universities right now. We're working with them with respect to advanced simulators and the like to make sure that we can get more, what we'll call throughput, but more controllers through those schools and get them out to the local facilities, centers, towers, TRACONs.
Great. I'm out of time. Yield back to the chair. Thank you all.
Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me start by saying that my heart goes out to the families and loved ones of the victims lost in the American Airlines Flight 5342 disaster at DCA, and not long after that, unfortunately, as well, the Bering Air crash in near Unalakleet and Nome, Alaska, flying over the Norton Sound area. And I'm thankful for the chairman for holding this hearing and appreciate the NTSB and FAA and DOD focusing on the after action so this doesn't happen again, either here in DC or in my state. And I do want to focus a little bit on my state, the great state of Alaska, because as I think all three of you know, we have a very high rates of airplane crashes, highest in the country, and airplane crash fatalities, which is why we launched with the NTSB's good work in 2020 and the FAA's good work in 2020, the FAA Alaska Safety Initiative called FOSI. And in last year's FAA reauthorization, I was able to include a number of provisions with the goal of reducing the rate of fatal aircraft accidents by 90%. That's a very ambitious goal. And require the FAA to improve maintenance of weather equipment. So, Mr. Administrator, I want to get into that topic a little bit. I was just home. It came up a lot, how there might be cancellations of weather operations and infrastructure and reporting, which makes zero sense to me. I hope our federal government is not doing that. But one of the things in the FAA bill, I was able to include requirements for systematic improvements to the maintenance of our weather systems and advancing new technologies. And this includes a mandate for the FAA to take necessary actions to restore full connectivity of weather systems that are unable to disseminate information due to a telecommunications failure. We have telecommunications challenges in a state the size of mine. So can you talk to that, Administrator Rushlow? And then I would like to get an update from your perspective on where we are on the FOSI initiative. As you know, the Secretary of Transportation and our press conference that we all did together, and again, I appreciate everybody participating in that, has made this a very top priority of his. And yet, as we saw in Alaska, we had a fatal crash that, hopefully we're going to learn from. Can I ask you on that, on the data link, telecoms, weather reporting, which is a big deal for my state?
Yes, sir, I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more based on our previous conversation. Your leadership, as a result of that and your request, I did travel recently to Alaska to go and understand more. I met with the NTSB lead investigator along with my investigators as it related to the Bering Air tragedy.
By the way, thank you both for coming up to Alaska. I know it's not the easiest, closest state to get to from Washington, D.C., but it's important that you're showing my constituents that it matters.
Yes, sir, and I agree. It's very important. I understand, having been there a number of times, the unique nature of Alaska, certainly its topography, as well as the need for safe aviation operations. So related to, again, reauthorization and the commitment to work to have better communications throughout Alaska, one of the initiatives, one of the reasons I went to Anchorage was to understand more about how the maintenance issues, the connectivity issues, whether that's on the telco side or satellite. And one of the things we're doing right now, and I met with our own technical operations people in the area to test Starlink, so satellite, because of the unique nature of it and the difficulty with telco. We needed another solution.
Yeah. And
one of the ways we believe we can do that is using satellite-based technology. And so that's what we're experimenting with right now.
Well, by the way, I really appreciate, the press here kind of went crazy and, Starlink and, that's actually really helpful for us. And we appreciate the secretary called me and said, hey, we're going to connect some of these terminals through Starlink because that's the most effective way to do it. So I appreciate it. I appreciated that you guys were working it. Can you give me an update or Madam Chair, an update on the FOSI initiative and then any preliminary findings you're seeing from the NTSB preliminary report on the Bering Air crash?
Senator Sullivan, this needs to be your last question.
It is, Mr. Chairman.
We are still working on that investigation, of course. The preliminary report was issued and did find that the aircraft was over 1,000 pounds overweight, but we also are going to look at the center of gravity on that airplane and see how that factored in. And then we are really focused in on weather that day as well. As you noted, weather infrastructure is critical for Alaska, and we have a number of recommendations on weather observing stations and also the importance of pilot reports and having air traffic control when a pilot reports weather conditions to pass that information along to other pilots in the area, and that's something we're looking at as part of this investigation in particular.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sullivan, thank you. I don't want to diminish the circumstances that Alaskans faced and the circumstance you as their senator represent. We're trying to get everybody's questions in before the vote closes, and I recognize Senator Klobuchar.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you. And to the families, just such a tragedy, and I know there are those watching at home as well, including the family, Wendy Jo Schaefer, a Minnesotan mom, 2 little kids, and husband. And we lost her. So, Chair, I want to thank you for your work. I know how complicated these investigations are. And could you just briefly talk about any open recommendations on communications that don't come out of this, that the NTSB, I know you have over 1,000 open safety recommendations, and while this investigation is ongoing, just open recommendations related to technology and anything that would improve communication?
Related to this investigation?
Not related.
Oh, not related.
I understand you.
We have a number of recommendations that remain open, including a number of recommendations issued to the FAA. On communications in particular, I mean, one thing I will mention that we haven't talked about that we are looking at as part of this investigation is our longstanding belief that ADSB in also needs to be mandated by the FAA. We don't know what relevance that has to this investigation yet. However, it is a longstanding position of the NTSB. It will provide key information to pilots. And in 2008, in our comments for a notice of proposed rulemaking to FAA, where they decided not to require it, we said equipage of aircraft with ADSB and capability will provide an immediate and substantial contribution to safety. Just a couple of years ago, and we just talked about Alaska, we investigated a midair collision in Ketchikan, and we reiterated, and this is the statement, that NTSB remains concerned that without a requirement to install and use ADSB supported airborne traffic advisory systems, mid-air collisions will continue to occur. And that was in 2019.
Okay.
So we'll look at that as part of this investigation.
Okay, thank you. We all know full funding of the FAA couldn't be more important. Last year, we passed the bipartisan FAA bill to improve aviation, workforce training, and actually Senator Braun, then Senator Braun, now Governor, and I had the bill to require the FAA to conduct maximum hiring of air traffic controllers at the FAA Academy. And I guess I'd ask you this, Acting Director Rushlow, you discussed in your testimony the efforts that Secretary Duffy and the FAA have taken to bolster the air traffic workforce. I think 91% of the air traffic control facilities operate below recommended staffing levels. I think there's 3,000, some short. This is, I got from some of the people who do this work. Can you talk to the current state of staffing and how do you plan to maintain recruiting levels? We did have an increase, I believe, last year.
Yes, Senator, and thank you for the question. This is a very important issue for the Secretary and myself as we look at the safety of the national airspace system in general, but certainly as we're looking to bring the best and brightest controllers into the airspace system to make sure that we're providing that safety for Americans as they travel through the air. I would say that As a result of this surge, we had over 10,000 applications. Over 8,000 of those have now been referred to testing. We've streamlined the process, cut roughly 5 months off that process. So going forward, we intend to have no empty seat at any upcoming academy classes. I would also say that we expect our partnerships with other schools, universities, to be able to bring more people into the career field itself. It's an exciting career, and even incentivizing students to come to Oklahoma City and with an additional 30%. We've kind of put all our focus on this effort in addition to the many other things we've got going on, but controller hiring is of paramount importance.
Very good. As you know, we have a very active airports in Minnesota, a major hub. I would ask you to look at the Duluth Air Traffic Control Tower, just because it's the third oldest in the nation, and Secretary Duffy's aware of it. It's had flooding, and it's a major air base up there as well for the Guard.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes, and Representative Stauber and I have been working together on that. Anyway, last question is just the importance of fully funding the FAA. Quickly, for both of you or all three of you.
I can talk about fully funding the NTSB.
Yes, please do.
You've done that on previous
you're
occasions.
important, but we did get an increase in funding that I do want to thank you for, to 145 in the CR. It was an anomaly, but for fully staffing the NTSB, right now we're at 427. We went down in the last couple of months because people left. We will be able to go up to 450, but fully staffing the NTSB to accomplish our mission would require hiring between 485 and 500 personnel, which requires resources. So as you consider FY26, it would be helpful.
That's very helpful.
And I certainly echo those sentiments. Fully funding the FAA is critical, not just for the workforce, but for our facilities and equipment. The situation is quite concerning to me as I review over 30% of our facilities being unsustainable going forward. We have to invest in that infrastructure going forward.
Thank you. I know that's no solace to the families, but knowing that that you were stepping back and looking at all of this right now, so other tragedies can be avoided, couldn't be more important. So thank you very much.
Gives me an opportunity to editorialize. We need to pass appropriation bills and not continue to utilize continuing resolutions. And that's directed at not necessarily my colleagues here, but my colleagues generally. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with your last statement. I just have two quick questions. General Brayman, I have never had a warrant officer be afraid to tell me when I was doing something wrong in the aircraft, and I prefer to have them as a pilot in command to myself. Speak a little bit to crew resource management and how it works in an air crew, especially, it was not just about, this is speaking to Senator Schmidt's question, not just about between the two pilots, but also the role of the crew chief, and do they have the ability to speak up as well?
Thank you, Ranking Member Duckworth. There's nothing more important in an air crew than crew resource management, and that is taught from day one. And everyone has an equal voice. And obviously the pilot in command is the one that's designated with the authority to command that aircraft. But I have never been in an aircraft that was ever in an environment where all members weren't a valued member of the team, and we rely on all those members to accomplish the missions we're doing.
Thank you. I'm just going to wrap up by saying how important it is to fund and resource the NTSB. You guys do amazing work. You yourself, Chairwoman, oftentimes I'll call you when something happens, whether it was a door plug incident or something, and you were already on the ground or in the air on your way there, and you need the resources to do your work. And as we're seeing from this investigation, how critically important that is, not just to find out what happened, but to prevent future accidents. So I could not agree with you more that we should be funding you. Mr. Rushlow, I think we also need to look at the facilities at FAA, and we need to talk to that. And I'd love to get your commitment to come out and tour the facilities in the Chicagoland area and see the condition of this repair that they are in.
I commit to that. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to the chairman, who's been very generous.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. I'm going to ask just a couple of tidbits, and I hope they're important questions more than tidbits, but I hope we'll be short so I can go vote. And I think that Senator Duckworth will close out the hearing in my absence. First of all, the fact that ADSB out, there's evidence that the transmissions were not received, and apparently the Army doesn't know that they weren't received. Why doesn't the FAA know they're not received?
I'm not aware of that. I know it's a part of the ongoing investigation. I don't believe that we receive any helicopter information from the Army.
But somebody has to be reporting that they were sent but not received. Who do they report that to?
Again, I think that's part of the investigation. My assumption would be the Army.
Okay.
Well, no. The Army could have it turned on, but I think what the chairwoman is saying is that the receiving station got no data, so the Army has got it turned on, and they don't know that it's not receiving. So this is, again, this communication issue between the different agencies.
Right. Senator Duckworth was speaking on my behalf. She said it exactly right.
I said you were generous.
I think my concluding question, and then I recognize Senator Markey. What is the current state, this is to you, Mr. Rocheleau, of operations at DCA? How are they different today than they were on January the 29th?
Yes, sir. Again, I appreciate it, the opportunity to explain. So immediately after January 29th, we restricted the airspace in the yellow box, as I showed in the previous graphic, for mixed traffic. So no helicopters or fixed wing will be in that box, if you will.
The yellow
box going forward. In the red section, that's
that is
where
still true today?
Yes, sir. And that is permanent. We've made that permanent. We've also eliminated Route 4 and Route 6, the crossing that goes over to Bowling Air Force Base from DCA.
Any other changes? Well, I would ask about number of flights. It appears to me, and my understanding is there are fewer flights utilizing Reagan National Airport?
Yes, sir. Thank you. In the aftermath, we reduced the rate, the arrival rate. A lot of that was to support the NTSB ongoing investigation and the emergency response work. Today, we are running at what we call a 30 rate, so 30 arrivals an hour. And we're doing that largely in partnership. I mean, we received great information from the NTSB regarding some feedback they were receiving during their preliminary investigation regarding the workload on the controllers themselves. Obviously, the tragic event has an effect. I mean, these people come to work every day. They care about what they do. And so we reduced the rate down to 26. Slowly, we move back to now we're at 30 rate.
And will that stay constant or change in the future?
So that right now, that's constant. That's staying. We're continuing to monitor that.
For the foreseeable future, the 30,
yes,
is it 32? 30?
It can go to 32, but right now we're at 30, and we plan to maintain that until such time as we assess the safety and being able to go to a higher rate.
Senator Markey, are you okay if I continue just a moment? I often, almost without exception, when I'm chairing a hearing, ask the witnesses at the end, the conclusion of the hearing, is there anything that you want to correct that you didn't say as you wish to say it? Something you want to make sure we hear? And then I'll turn conducting this hearing over to Senator Duckworth. Ms. Hamady?
That's when all my staff cringe when I chime in. On this one, I would say I know there is a lot of focus on the FAA right now. I do think they are very focused on safety. We have an excellent relationship and have been in communication constantly since this accident. I would say one area we're really looking at also is how the Army evaluates when there's reporting of close calls. Do they get those reports, the Army I'm talking about? And how do they communicate, at the battalion level, how do they communicate and talk about safety? How do they evaluate safety? Are they getting reports? Are they monitoring their own helicopters that might exceed altitude levels? We have found so far that a lot of the conversation and safety discussion at the battalion level is really focused on OSHA slips, trips, and falls. There is a disconnect on some of the discussion around safety and safety assurance from the Army as a whole versus the battalion level. So we're really looking at that.
please answer this question, but just in my absence.
Yes, sir. And I appreciate the opportunity. I just want to make it crystal clear that something was missed at the DCA crash. I take that seriously. I take that upon myself. I returned to the FAA just 2 months ago because I care about the national airspace system and the safety and the workforce. I'm dedicated to continuing that work. And I will continue to review what I mentioned before with respect to the hotspots, working closely with NTSB to learn what happened here and to make sure it never happens again.
General, I'm going to ask you to suspend so Mr. Markey can ask his question, because he's going to miss a roll call vote if he doesn't get to. I recognize Mr. Markey.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I want to take a moment to express my deepest condolences to the families who lost loved ones in the tragic crash in January. Your pain is unimaginable, and your presence here today is a powerful reminder of the lives that were so suddenly and unfairly taken. I want to specifically note the individuals from the Skating Club of Boston who passed away in this crash. Spencer Lane, Christine Lane, Gina Hahn, Jin Hahn, Jenya Shishkova, Vadim Naumov. We had a similar plane crash in 1961 that devastated the Skating Club of Boston. The trauma for the city of Boston and for your families is great. So please know that we grieve with you, and we are committed to finding answers and accountability in honor of those who you have lost. Chair Hamidi, thank you and the entire NTSB team for your work to investigate this crash. I want to discuss the altitude of the Black Hawk helicopter. NTSB's preliminary report notes that a few minutes before the crash, the pilot indicated that the helicopter was flying at an altitude of 300 feet, while the instructor pilot said it was at 400 feet. The report also found that helicopters may have been above the altitude restriction in over half of near misses that triggered an advisory from the plane's traffic alert and collision avoidance system. In your experience, are altitude discrepancies like this common, and are you concerned that Black Hawk altimeters may have a systemic problem?
This barometric altimeter, we've done substantial examination on it. We don't think we're going to get much from this altimeter because there was such damage. We're going to have to look at other data, but I think it's too early to really say what the discrepancy was or whether it was a discrepancy. There was no information other than 1.1 nautical miles west of the Key Bridge when the pilot flying said, I'm at 300, and the pilot instructor said, I have you at 4. There was no further discussion of why. So there's a lot of work that still has to be done.
Administrator Rushlow, on a related issue, Elon Musk recently made alarmist claims about the FAA's air traffic control communication system. He said the FAA assessment is single-digit months to catastrophic failure, putting air traffic safety at serious risk. The situation is extremely dire. Elon Musk is in charge of all of the investigations into every single federal agency. That's scary. And this is at the same time that he may be pushing for Starlink, his own company, to take over the contract to upgrade the communication system. And 1 month ago, the FAA announced it was deploying multiple Starlink terminals across the country. Give these systems critical importance to our aviation system. These developments raise serious questions about aviation safety. So I would like you to set the record straight on this issue. He said, basically, we have digit months to catastrophic failure, putting air traffic safety at serious risk. Is that tweet accurate?
I would say that the circumstances around our air traffic system are in great need of renewal. We
I
need
didn't
to
ask you that.
modernize.
I didn't ask you that. I asked, the public needs to hear this. Are we within single-digit months to catastrophic failure, putting air traffic safety at serious risk?
I know we need new air traffic control facilities. I know we need that. I know
No, you're saying we are at risk. Is that what you're saying? Are you agreeing with him that we are?
I'm saying our air traffic system needs modernization as soon as possible.
You understand, we can't have people heading for airports all across the country right now with Elon Musk, the ear of the president, saying that we're within single-digit months of catastrophic failure. Can you assure people that that's not the case right now?
I can assure you the flying public, to fly is safe. We have the safest, most complex system in the world, and it is safe to fly. I would also say the air traffic system is in dire need of upgrade, and it's something the Secretary and I have been working on intensely.
Well, so you're saying that this is not right. We're not within months of a catastrophic failure, because I don't think anyone wants to put a family member on a plane right now with this kind of assessment. Have you made the assessment that we're within a single-digit months of catastrophic failure? Have you made that assessment?
I have reviewed assessments in the last 2 months and understand that our equipment needs to be upgraded.
I didn't ask you that. Is the existing equipment safe? Is the existing equipment putting travelers' safety at serious risk? Yes or no?
The existing system is safe.
Is safe, all right. We need to know that, okay? Are any SpaceX employees serving as special government employees at the FAA right now?
We had 3 special government employees from SpaceX. We are only in contact with 1 at this point. I would make it very clear they did not do any air traffic. They didn't plug into any equipment. They came in to observe our operations and provided expertise along the lines of software and computer systems and how we...
Did any employee have any involvement in the FAA's decision to deploy Starlink terminals in February?
I'm sorry, if you could just repeat that question.
Did any of those DOGE employees have any involvement in the FAA's decision to deploy Starlink terminals in February?
There were no DOGE employees in that decision. Starlink is being tested at a number of our facilities, only tested and not plugged into any air traffic systems.
Are any of these employees involved in the decision-making process around the deployment of additional Starlink terminals?
No, sir.
Okay. So I recognize that Starlink terminals may be an effective communications tool in remote areas, and I'm sure Starlink engineers think highly of their potential. We just need to be extremely careful.
Yes, sir.
That in making these life and death decisions, that they're not based on any pre-existing professional biases or financial conflicts. That's your job. You got to make sure this is the way we operate, because we're going to have hearings on this as this year and next year unfold. So I thank you, and I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to return to General Brayman so he can conclude his remarks.
Thank you, Senator. I do want to clarify 2 quick points. One on the memo requested by the chairman and both chairmen. It can be made available. However, it is part of the investigation. That is the unit's memo that discusses how they utilize ADSB out off. It's their policy letter. It is in the purview of the investigation. That is why it's not currently releasable. But certainly when the NTSB and the other investigations have done their due diligence, that we can look to make that available to the committee.
Sure.
For the NTSB, if the policy existed prior to the collision, you can provide it. That can be provided.
Thank you.
And
what's your second point?
And the second one, talking about whether we're willing to change the policy, the Army's policy. The Army is always willing to review its policy. Am I prepared to make a decision on ADSB out right now? No, Senator, but I want to do that informed by the facts that we have in this investigation. And those will drive policy changes. And that is not the Army policy, that's DOD policy. And the Army certainly has a vested interest in getting it right. But at the end of the day, what I'm most concerned about is the rigid application of that policy, that it's being done correctly and not being abused. And that is part of this investigation as well.
Thank you. Senator Cantwell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to just go back to this process, how it's set up in the FAA and how we rectify these issues in the future. But Chairwoman Hamady, I think you're saying in your earlier testimony that even if the Black Hawk helicopter had hugged the shoreline as originally described, that even that route that's outlined is insufficient. Your investigation showed that even that is insufficient.
Intolerable risk to aviation safety.
Okay, intolerable risk to aviation safety. So, Acting Administrator, how did we get to a point where we have a route that's allowed and mapped, that the military is flying, that's interfacing with commercial aviation, that as by the very definition, the NTSB is saying it was, even if they flew the correct path, was an intolerable risk? I think you're saying that because the difference in separation was just too small.
There's virtually no margin of error.
No margin of error. How are you defining margin of error, just out of?
I mean, just looking at this, and I think you have the printout in front of you, hopefully, or staff has it, that we provided. This is in, for the public, this is in our preliminary report, and for those behind me, but the chart, when we looked at the when we mapped the glide slope, and we looked at the helicopter route, which has no lateral boundaries, it's 75 feet max if you're hugging the shoreline. The collision actually occurred to the right and slightly above the dash line right here. And commercial, and just so you know, pilots for landing on runway 33 don't have to be on this dash line. They can be above or below. But it occurred about to the right. They were not on the on this route. They were slightly over.
You're saying under this route, they could have been below or above this line, but you're now saying that 75 feet is not enough separation.
75 feet is the max. Because there's no lateral boundaries on this route, it goes down as you come over. And so helicopters are not always on that eastern shoreline, which is where the 75 feet is marked. And they weren't in this situation. They were actually to the right of this gray shaded area, which indicates the route that has no boundaries.
But I thought your analysis, even if they were on that route, it's still an intolerable risk because there's not enough separation.
75 feet is very small.
Right, so how did we get to this point is my question. How did we get to this point? It's like, it's a series of errors here, a series of errors. And so I'm just trying to understand, Acting Administrator, what office is responsible for this? What office is responsible for the exemption to the rule, which just made it worse? But what office said this is a safe pathway in agreement when the NTSB is telling us today it never really was safe? It wasn't. It was an intolerable risk.
And certainly I understand today, and even after the preliminary report, that was the assessment. I can tell you that, and I'm sure we'll learn more over time as to how the airspace was redesigned. I know that as a result of previous incidents that we've talked about earlier today, there were changes over time with respect to that airspace, but it's one of the reasons why we immediately terminated those types of operations after the event. So Route 4, Route 6, no mixed traffic into the airspace. Those are the things that we put in place immediately. I think when you talk about how did we get there, I think we're going to learn more of that through the investigation. Again, I can confidently say, without knowing specifically what's in the investigation, that over time, those routes, that airspace was designed. It's one of the reasons why we've gone back to the hotspots now throughout the nation to understand the circumstances by which we move traffic safely and efficiently.
What office at the FAA has oversight of this issue as it relates to this area?
So the air traffic organization builds out the airspace, and there's an aviation safety office that reports directly to me that oversees the air traffic organization.
And did that office ever bring up any of this data or information or have input from anybody that said, we don't like this scenario, there's too many close calls, too much interface, too complex, too hard to deal with?
On this specific route, I'm not aware of that. I know that when we are presented with those, and we have been, and that's how airspace changes, when we're presented with those circumstances, situations, near-miss or collisions, we investigate them and we put mitigations in place.
Well, I'm questioning whether anybody was investigating. I mean, that's the issue. You had an alarm going off once a month. You had the data. Maybe you're saying maybe people weren't looking at it. And while I get that AI is this very new and interesting technology, it's no substitute for the FAA having an oversight over this level of traffic. And so, as my colleague, the chair of this hearing, mentioned, that like now we want to know, do we have other problems in other airspaces? I mean, we're very focused on DCA, but now we want to know, we have big military complexes, 10 bases, 10 military installations in the state of Washington. I'm sure Chicago has a lot. We want to know, do we have to worry about this somewhere else because the FAA isn't looking and doesn't have an organization that is overseeing this information?
I agree 100% with you. This is of utmost concern to me, not just in the DCA area, which, again, we've put measures in place to reduce the risk and to make the airspace less complex. This is one of the reasons why we have a task force working on what we're calling hotspots, to ensure that we're looking at airspace design wherever we have mixed traffic in 10 locations. I believe it's a total of 21 airports specifically, to see where similar traffic like this needs mitigation.
So you say this office reports directly to you, and you say this they oversee these areas and the interface.
So let me be clear about that. The office that oversees air traffic reports directly to me. The task force, the group of people that are looking at these hotspots specifically, are part of multiple parts of the agency: air traffic, aviation safety, airports. So we have a number of people part of that effort to make sure that we're looking at the airspace design, and if we find risk, we react.
Well, there was risk, for sure. There was risk. It was being sounded in an alarm, and it wasn't being addressed. So now we have to figure out why that wasn't being addressed. There's a lot of information here that says very high risk, very high risk. So why was that ignored, or was no one looking at it? So we need an answer. I think this committee did very good work, in my opinion, after the Columbia accident, and set up more safety offices to make sure that we never miss something like that again. And I feel like that's the issue we're asking you today. And so we need to understand what you think is in place and why. If it was in place, did we miss this because little pieces of the responsibility was delegated to various parts of the organization and nobody had a holistic approach? Or, data, lots of data, and it's being ignored. But this is a clear that this was an unacceptable design. It's just unacceptable. And I don't know how we got there. I do want to ask you, are you now supportive of ADSB in as a requirement? Making sure that carriers like this regional jet, again, I mentioned earlier, it's $20,000 or so per plane. Why can't we just say we're going to do this?
I did understand from the chair earlier that it's been an ongoing recommendation. I have not personally looked into that in the last 2 months as to what the expectations are on ADSBN. I know that equipage on aircraft throughout the system can be challenging, but I certainly will take that back and look into it to figure out what specifically ADSBN would be, what would be required to mandate that. Certainly if Congress passes a law, we would, as we did with...
We already did, by the way, we already did. It was called the reauthorization bill. And as I said in my opening statement, we basically authorized spending for this through the equipage program. And, you can discuss how this actually gets deployed, but I'm pretty sure the consumer ends up paying for it regardless in some way. And so the point is, NTSB has been recommending this. Is that right, Chairwoman?
That's correct.
You've recommended this since 2008?
And I have to look, but I think we actually have recommendations on ADSB in that precedes that. Those were comments, and if I may I add our 2008 comments to the hearing record? Thank you.
Without objection.
So I think, Acting Administrator, I think we need to hear from the Department of Transportation and the FAA that they understand that these recommendations have been on the table and you need to respond to them. We don't want to do that. We don't want to keep doing this, which is having one organization who has to investigate all the accidents, deal with all the families, deal with the grief and emotion, and then have an FAA that gets too cozy with industry and gives them exemptions. We don't want that. And so what we want is you to listen to the NTSB. And I know this is historic. I'm not blaming any administration. It's historic. It's historic. It's been there since the beginning of the big crashes that we've had, way before the MAX, where the FAA makes safety recommendations and then they're ignored for like, oh, I don't know, sometimes a decade. And then people finally say, oh, okay. But we owe it to these families. We owe it to them now. It's not that hard to get this done. So I hope you will take this back to the Secretary, have an internal discussion, and basically agree it's time to get this done. Yes.
And if I may add, and we're going to look at this as part of our investigation to see how it could have factored in, but the CRJ had ADSB out. It did not have ADSB in. And so we are going to look at what that information could have provided to that flight crew and how it could have made a difference. We've seen that in other investigations, which is why we have these recommendations.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I do think that a nationwide look is important. I'm glad that FAA is looking at the hotspots. I understand that many of these routes, it's not just the military that's flying them. It is local law enforcement. It is federal law enforcement. It is hospitals are all flying them as well. But I do think beyond a very local, local look, a national look is really important. Thank you all for coming. Again, my condolences to the family members. I just want to say again, thank you. Thank you again to Chairwoman Hamidi. Thank you, Mr. Rushlow. I know you've only been acting for a couple of months. We're without an FAA administrator for 3 years prior to your immediate predecessor. And again, General Raymond, thank you for being here. Thank you to all the witnesses for their important testimony today. Senators will have until the close of business on Thursday, April 3rd to submit questions for the record. The witnesses will have until the close of business on Thursday, April 17th to respond to those questions. And this concludes today's hearing. The committee stands adjourned.